My name is Mitch Guthrie, and this is the Long Letter Podcast, episode 23. And it's been a minute since I last published an episode. It's been over a year. And all I have to say is that we are led by a volunteer group of people for this podcast, and they suck. I'm the volunteer. I suck. Anyways, it's neither here nor there. This episode is going to kind of focus on our little small town politics and all the weirdness and machinations that go along with it. And I'm going to focus on an interaction that had occurred in January that highlighted an interesting concern of Lewis County Commissioner Lindsay Pollock and the response from her seatmate, Commissioner Sean Swope. And so, and for those of you who follow on Facebook, I had actually posted this exchange the day it happened. Now, I'm also going to focus on sort of the coverage of this event that was published February 6th, an article by the Chronicle by reporter Emily Fitzgerald. And it's incredibly convoluted. There are multiple parties, organizations, and events to this story. So I'm going to try and quickly summarize all the who, what, when, where sort of details and just kind of walk through. So I apologize in advance. It is going to be a lot of dates and people to track. And if you can get through it, that's great. So here we are. Let's start with the parties involved. So first there is Scott and Lindsay Pollock. Lindsay is a Lewis County Commissioner for District 2, and Scott, her husband, I guess would be the first gentleman. I don't know what the title or honorific would be for spouses, but that's not important. Then there's the Lewis County Sheriff, Rob Snaza, and his deputy, now Detective Aaron Willie. And we even see appearances from Lewis County Commissioner for District 1, Sean Swope, and also Kyle Wheeler, local activist, political gadfly, and super gay cheese shop owner who has his own sort of contributions in this whole thing. All right, so those are the parties, and let's discuss kind of the entities involved. So first of all, there's Lewis County, which has to do with Commissioners Pollock and Swope. We have Lewis County Sheriff's Office, which has to do with Snaza and Detective Willie. And then we have the Criminal Justice Training Commission, Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission. And their stated purpose is that they certify police, corrections, and limited authority officers who meet the definition for certification in Washington State and successfully complete training in their required academy. So basically, they're the certifying authority for peace officers in Washington State. On their website, they also say they play an important role in police accountability through its decertification processes. So under state law, the WSCJTC, Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission, can deny, suspend, or revoke this certification or require remedial training for officers who engage in certain misconduct. So now let's discuss the ongoing issues that are going to be highlighted in this episode. So we have the who and we have what entities are involved. Let's kind of break down a little bit of the issues. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about Scott Pollock's longstanding claims of harassment by his neighbor, and that apparently has resulted in somewhere between 80 to 100 calls to the sheriff's office over an almost 10-year period. Okay, so that's one issue there. Another issue we have is a Criminal Justice Training Commission complaint filed against Aaron Willie in December of 2022 by local activist, political gadfly, and super gay cheese shop owner Kyle Wheeler regarding her former affiliation with Proud Boys. According to reporting by the Chronicle, quote, the CJTC received a complaint against Willie on December 22nd, 2022, stemming from his incident where she wore the Proud Boys girls sweatshirt in public while she was employed as a peace officer with the Clark County Sheriff's Office. After completing an investigation into the 2022 complaint, the CJTC filed a statement of charges against Willie on November 13th, 2024. which was served to Willie on November 26. In the statement of charges, the CJTC states that it received a complaint alleging that Willie engaged in conduct subjecting her peace officer certification to discipline. Discipline could include remedial training or denial, suspension, or revocation of her peace officer certification. Anyways, so ultimately, Kyle Wheeler's complaint was what ended up bringing forth the statement of charges against Detective Willie. At the time, Deputy Willie. So, and then we get into that issue also, the promotion to detective of Aaron Willie, who has a Brady letter. And then another aspect of this whole saga is Scott Pollock receiving notification that Aaron Willie was submitting a referral of charges against him regarding the ongoing harassment claims of Scott against his neighbor. And so if that weren't enough, we also then have a Criminal Justice Training Commission complaint filed against Aaron Willie in November of 2024 from Scott Pollock regarding the referral of charges previously mentioned. So as of January, that complaint has now been closed, according to reporting by the Chronicle. The CJTC notified the Lewis County Sheriff's Office on January 29th that it had finished reviewing Scott Pollock's complaint and determined that the alleged conduct does not invoke the CJTC's jurisdiction. And as a result, the CJTC told the Sheriff's Office in an email, we are closing this case without further action. So I think a reasonable approach to covering this is to look at what I'm going to call the inciting incident. And for both the short video I created earlier and the Chronicle's reporting, I think it's fair to say that the inciting incident was the Board of County Commissioners meeting on January 7th, where Commissioner Pollock raised her concerns regarding the promotion of an officer with a Brady letter, and Commissioner Swope responded by highlighting the CJTC complaint filed by Lindsay Pollock's husband, Scott Pollock, against Willie. Now, I'm just going to share that part of the meeting because I already put it together earlier. So here we go.
I do have some concerns about this one. We had, not with you, Grace, but we had a couple of invoices submitted, 353817 and 354117, clothing allowance basically for $662.05. This is for a recently promoted deputy who went to detective. This particular deputy already has a Brady letter on file and basically is not able to effectively testify.
Okay.
This level of promotion, when we're trying to deal with budget gaps, is basically the issue we are seeing with funding. The funding stops at our desks. And yes, the sheriff is an independent elected official, but when they move forward employees that are unable to do their job, it reflects poorly on us, it reflects poorly on the county, and quite frankly, it sets us up for liability. And I think this is something we need to pay a lot closer attention to.
Can you give me that number again, Commissioner?
Yes, could you please send that to our office, what invoice numbers, so that we could take a look at them?
So they are 353817 and 354117. I did look at them. They do, and I spoke with Becky. It does fall under the collective bargaining agreement. It is an appropriate expenditure within the agreement. The fundamental issue here, though, is that we were dealing with budget deficits. We noted that there was a vacancy in the detectives, and apparently it has been filled by someone who has a Brady letter already, and before the invoices were submitted, also is subject to decertification from the CJTC. They had received their letter. They're in the 60-day window to appeal.
If I may, Commissioner, we should likely address this with the sheriff and ask him to come over and discuss that specifically. I would certainly be willing to ask for that to take place. As far as this, are you questioning the validity of the warrants and payroll as far as the legality of issuing any of these?
I think the legality of issuing them in the current position is that it is authorized through that, given that the promotion has occurred and the CBA allows for it. However, it is the underlying issue that we need to address.
Okay.
Is this the same deputy that you and your husband reported to CJTC?
Please show me where I have ever reported a deputy.
You're referred in one of the complaints. You're directly mentioned in one of the complaints.
Yeah, I was mentioned. I did not make it. Also, the particular CJTC complaint against this deputy is not related.
Just another way for you to take a shot at the sheriff's department.
All right. So it starts with a clothing allowance discussion, a budget issue, which Commissioner Pollock is not challenging. Pollock brings up the Criminal Justice Training Commission's possible decertification of Willie, and Pollock does not mention Willie by name or gender. And then Swope responds by noting the other Criminal Justice Training Commission complaint against Willie from Scott Pollock. So I think I'm comfortable saying that this is the inciting incident that kind of brings it all to the forefront of my attention and the Chronicle's attention. And this is kind of where things kind of kicked off and ended up being reported on, I guess you could say. So what I want to do is kind of turn my attention to the Chronicle article on this. So almost 1 month later, on February 6th, the Chronicle publishes an article on not just that interaction, but expands the coverage. They include Scott Pollock's ongoing harassment issue with the neighbor, including references to 911 CAD call logs. CAD is computer-aided dispatch logs, and Scott Pollock's body cam footage. It also includes complaints to the Criminal Justice Training Commission against Aaron Willie from one, the local activist, political gadfly, and super gay cheese shop owner Kyle Wheeler, and two, Scott Pollock's complaint regarding Willie's referral of charges. And then it covers allegations from Sheriff Snaza that Commissioner Pollock's concerns are retaliatory and related to Scott Pollock's Criminal Justice Training Commission complaint against Willie, given that Willie was the one responding to his harassment issue with a neighbor. And then it sort of wraps up with a defense from Sheriff Snaza regarding the promotion to detective of a peace officer with a Brady letter, which, we'll get into. So, and then along with this particular article from the Chronicle is a 37-minute video from the Chronicle's YouTube page of Scott Pollock's body cam footage, condensed. Or not condensed, sorry. What do you want to say? Compiled. So, first off, I just want to say that I think the article by Emily Fitzgerald is pretty solid, considering everything that she's trying to cover in it. It's difficult to summarize any sort of coherent fashion, unfolding events that have lots of moving pieces and history. And like I said, I think she does a good job here. I'm not a journalist or anything, so take that, for what it's worth. But I would like to point out that the Chronicle has had several writers that have been very good at summarizing challenging subjects, such as Claudia Ya, Isabel Vanderstoop, Mitchell Rowland, Owen Sexton, and I'd put Emily Fitzgerald in this category. And having said that, the headline for it was kind of unwieldy from my perspective. I think they had difficulty capturing this whole story. And so the headline is, quote, Lewis County Sheriff alleges retaliation by commissioner who claims recent promotion amounts to safety risk, culture problems. Now, I had to read that a few times to make sure I understood what it was conveying. And I don't know, it reminded me of this from Parks and Rec.
Headline idea. It's the end of the world as they know it, but Pawnee feels fine. It's a little long. Okay, Zorp Schmorp. Doomsday prediction falls flat as citizens spend pleasant evening enjoying one of Pawnee's finest parks. Somehow longer. Right, okay, let's go with the first one.
So regardless, while the headline does capture the gist of the content, I find it an interesting choice to make Sheriff Snaza the subject and is alleging the predicate of this headline. It's not a big deal, and a legitimate argument could be made, I think, defending this particular headline. The subhead is even more awkward and I'll read that here. Quote, "A decade of calls. Commissioner Lindsay Pollock questions promotion of deputy facing action from Criminal Justice Training Commission, who also referred charges against her husband linked to a decade-long dispute with neighbor." And I mean, that's fine, I guess. I just feel like it's really odd that they bookended it with this whole decade issue. And, I would definitely wager that depending on where somebody lines up on these issues, they would likely pick a headline or a subhead that matches what they feel is the most important topic in the article. And given the wide-ranging issues highlighted by this article, there are many options available for headline choice. Like I said, these things can be debated, and there's likely no headline that would have pleased everyone. But if I were asked who benefited more from the wording of this headline and subhead, I'd have to say that it probably benefits Snaza and his allegation of retaliation. But whatever, that's neither here nor there. I guess the question I have is there more to this story? And considering the parts of the story go back over a decade, yeah, there's obviously more to the story. I guess specifically, are there more details out there that may illuminate or perhaps complicate some of these events? And I think so, not to mention going back to this whole crazy machinations of things that we get that happen here in our little community when we have elections and things. So the first thing I want to talk on is the referral of charges regarding Scott Pollock. The Chronicle reports, and I quote, "Responding to Lindsay Pollock's comments on January 7th, Swope brought up a CJTC complaint filed November 26 by Lindsay Pollock's husband, Scott Pollock, against Willie after Willie referred Scott Pollock to the Lewis County Prosecutor's Office for possible malicious prosecution and disorderly conduct charges in connection to his ongoing dispute with a neighbor." Now, I wanted to better understand the chronology of events here. See, the Chronicle article doesn't state when this referral of charges was sent. According to the Chronicle, Scott Pollock said Willie's referral was sent after I reported to her that I had been threatened by my neighbor subject to a protective order. I am the petitioner. Now, given that this event is the precursor to Scott Pollock's own complaint against Aaron Willie, and therefore the later claim by Sheriff Snaza that this was done as retaliation, I felt it was important to understand when all of this started. And so I reached out to Commissioner Pollock to ask what event sparked the referral of charges, and she replied that on July 29th, 2024, was the incident with the neighbor, where Deputy Willie subsequently referred Scott for charges of malicious prosecution and disorderly conduct. It was later, on August 7th, that the Pollocks were informed Willie had sent a referral of charges to the Lewis County Prosecuting Attorney. Later, on November 26th, Scott Pollock filed his Criminal Justice Training Commission complaint against Willie. So these details were not captured in the reporting, the original reporting, so I kind of want to recap real quick because I think there's some important information here. So, July 29th, Scott Pollock calls regarding the violation of a harassment order. Aaron Willie responds. She talks with Scott briefly over the phone and gets no response from knocking on the neighbor's door. 9 days later, on August 7th, 2024, Scott Pollock is informed that Aaron Willie referred charges to the prosecuting attorney. And then November 26th, almost 4 months after that, Scott Pollock files a Criminal Justice Training Commission complaint against Willie. At face value, these dates aren't exactly telling you anything. They're not really telling at all until you consider the 2024 election. See, the August primaries, the one where Commissioner Pollock took almost 60% of the vote against her opponent, Christina Riley, was held August 6th. It was then, the day after the election, that Pollocks were notified of the referral of charges against Scott Pollock, the day after Lindsay Pollock seemingly secured her commissioner seat. Now, this raises some questions, like how long does it normally take to refer charges? Does it normally take 9 days? Were the charges referred to on the day that Pollocks had been notified or earlier, which would have been before the election? And Does the prosecuting attorney or the sheriff's office have some sort of policy regarding the referral of charges against political candidates nearing a primary or a general election? Interesting enough, the body cam footage of Willie talking with the neighbor does answer some of these questions. In short, it appears that Willie was able to discuss charges with the neighbor and refer them the same day. So it doesn't seem like it takes very long. And based off of that information, she also notified Scott Pollock that same day. So, but having said that, the omission of the ongoing election from the reporting on this issue, I think, is unfortunate. So let's return to the reporting. Let's look at sources of information here. Now, one of the things I was curious about was how some of this information was sourced, meaning that some of these things are not publicly available without a request to an appropriate authority. And someone somewhere had to obtain this information for it to be reported on. Makes sense. And before I get into this, I just want to say up front that I don't believe that it's an issue for source material to have been provided by, say, like an opponent of somebody. As long as the material was, in fact, legitimate, unaltered data, it's the whole, trust but verify thing. And the data really should stand on its own, and its validity is not dependent on who provided it. However, I think that given that there are claims of retaliation, I think trying to determine sources could give light to who may be retaliating against who, or whom, or is it whomever? Yeah, it doesn't matter. Anyways, so let's look in some of the statements about information that was likely sourced and see what we can find. So the first up is the ongoing dispute with the neighbor. According to the Chronicle, Lewis County communication call logs obtained by the Chronicle indicate that Scott Pollock called the Lewis County Sheriff's Office at least 89 times, while Scott Pollock says that there have been, quote, hundreds of reports between May 2nd, 2015 and December 6th, 2024. To make complaints against his neighbor identified in the Sheriff's Office call logs as Linda L. Chu. So 911 call logs are public record, and therefore they're available upon request. The most likely source for this information then would be somebody having requested it in a public records request. So I checked the public records requests going back to January 1st of 2024, and I found 4 dealing with call logs having to do with the Pollocks. So the first and the oldest public records request was submitted on August 2nd, 2024. This is 4 days before the primary from Lacey Clark. And I think this might perhaps be the same Lacey Clark who was associated with the Lewis County Young Republicans. Not sure. The second public records request was submitted on August 16th. So this is 10 days after the primaries from a Tim Klein. Now, I'm not familiar with Tim Klein or why he would be interested in these call logs, but I did discover that the property owner across the street from the Pollocks shares the same name. And I've been told that he may have had Christina Riley signs on their property. Anyways. And then the third request was submitted on December 2nd, 2024 by fellow Commissioner Sean Swope. And then later, another from Sean Swope was submitted on January 9th with a follow-up for the data between his previous request. So, of note here is that this most recent public records request from Sean Swope would also be the one that would include calls through December 6th, which the Chronicle article refers to. So just take note of that. Notably absent, however, from this list is a request by somebody from the Chronicle, which, as I have said before, is like totally fine. If they receive their materials indirectly and the materials are legitimate, the source doesn't really matter. It would only speak to perhaps the motivation of the source in wanting to provide this, perhaps in the hope that the Chronicle would publish it. And in fact, in the news dump episode after the Chronicle published their article on all this, Eric Schwartz, editor-in-chief, had this to say.
It's not like we just learned about this. It was pretty heavy as far as tips go, trying to get us to report on this before the election last time when Pollock was running. And to me, it's kind of sensitive because it's a 10-year property dispute. I'm not disputing that her husband feels threatened and harassed by the neighbor. So it's like, it did not feel right to just roll out right before the election and be like, Lewis County Commissioner's husband is a drain on resources for, like, that's what the tipsters would have wanted.
Yeah.
But it all kind of spilled out in a Lewis County Commissioners meeting because one of the deputies that has responded at one point referred charges against Scott Pollock for the neighborhood dispute, who has a protection order, I believe, or harassment order against the neighbor.
All right. Well, first off, like, I'm low-key annoyed that I spent all this time digging around trying to find info that can maybe give some sort of insight behind the sourcing of this material. And damn it, if Eric Schwartz doesn't just say it out loud after I'd already done all the work. So not cool, man. Not cool. Second, though, as sources go, this information can only reveal parties that went through normal publicly available channels. So I just want to keep that in mind. The material could also have been sourced directly via a county employee, such as a 911 dispatcher or someone from the Lewis County Sheriff's Office. So at this time that I had done this research, I had no real insight other than that there was a lot of activity around this. Who could have provided it to the Chronicle? But we'll get into that here in a moment. So moving on to the body cam footage, there are some oddities here that I think exist around the body cam footage as shared by the Chronicle. One, it's only Scott Pollock's body cam footage. It doesn't seem to contain any body cam footage from responding officers, which would have been nice to have, I guess. And then two, the video contains the following claims. So when you go watch the video, it has a disclaimer up front. It says, the following video footage is unedited and was provided to the Chronicle through a public records request. It includes raw footage from Ronald Scott Pollock's body camera. Now, the records request that I had mentioned earlier didn't really specify any body cam footage, though I suppose they could have amended or clarified their initial request while discussing it with Public Records Officer, but I doubt that the PRO would maybe go out of their way to provide files that aren't clearly requested. At the time, the closest request that might have included it was from Lacey Clark, but on review, the body cam footage wasn't provided in her public records request. There is one specifically for body cam footage, a public records request regarding the Pollocks, and that was submitted on January 8th, 2025, the day after the inciting incident by Chronicle owner and operator Chad Taylor to Lewis County. However, the request was withdrawn, and so I reached out to the PRO, the Public Records Officer, to ask what that status meant. They responded that it means the requester advised us that they no longer want or need the records and to close the request. So I was curious if any files had been provided before the request was withdrawn, and I was told that Mr. Taylor withdrew his request and no records were provided to him via the Records Center portal. So I then kind of turned my attention to the complaint that Scott Pollock filed with the Criminal Justice Training Commission and discovered that body cam footage had been submitted as a part of that complaint. And there was, in fact, a criminal justice training records request submitted by Emily Fitzgerald of the Chronicle. However, when I asked the Criminal Justice Training Commission on February 20th if any documents had been provided on those records requests, on that records request, I was informed that no documents had been provided yet. So it obviously couldn't have been provided. It couldn't have provided the video for the body cam footage that the Chronicle published. So this led me to kind of think through other possible sources of the body cam footage. I think I can reasonably say that these could have also come directly from the sheriff's office, I guess, without an official records request, though that would contradict the Chronicle's statement from the video, and that these could have come directly from someone at the prosecuting attorney's office, as they may have received them when the charges have been referred, though once again, this would contradict the Chronicle's statement from the video. I then requested all released files from these former public records requests, the one by Lacey Clark and Tim Klein and the two from Sean Swope. And the only one that contained the body cam footage that was shared via the Chronicle reporting was the December 2nd request by Lewis County Commissioner Sean Swope. So what's the takeaway here? I think there are kind of several things that we can consider when looking at this issue. I think there are several parties that seem to have taken an interest in this decade-long harassment issue with Scott Pollock and his neighbor. And it raises a question of why these parties would be interested and what they were going to do with the information that they received. I also think that all of this interest coincided with the primary election where Lindsay Pollock was engaged in a contentious race for county commissioner. Unfortunately, that was apparently overlooked in the coverage on the issue. I also think, however, based on his comments from the Chronicle News Dump, Eric Schwartz, Chronicle Editor-in-Chief, not only mentions that this information was sourced by opponents of Lindsay Pollock, but that those same opponents would have liked the information to come to light during the election. So that's another kind of takeaway that we have here. Another thing is the day after Commissioner Pollock likely secured her commissioner position with 60% of the vote moving into the general election, LCSO deputy, now detective Aaron Willie, then decides to visit the neighbor in the harassment dispute and hours later notifies Scott Pollock that she's referring charges against him. Furthermore, when it comes to the Chronicle, I've been told by somebody that I trust that there's a sort of firewall between the newsroom and the business side. In short, between Eric Schwartz and the Taylors or the Silver Agency. The claim is there's some sort of independence from the newsroom, from the business side of things, and one doesn't have influence on the other. And personally, from my perspective, I can say that there does seem to be some sort of separation of concerns, and I think that's great. However, when I see Chad Taylor personally submitting a public records request on a topic that's generating some political activity, it does make me kind of question how firm this separation of concerns is. So take that for what it's worth. Furthermore, the fact that his request was withdrawn and no body cam footage had been provided at the time, and no other public records requests by the Chronicle appeared to have obtained the footage, I'm left wondering if that intro text of the video was more misleading than it needed to be. At first glance, it seems to indicate that the Chronicle was provided the body cam footage via a public records request that a person would likely assume they had requested. The actual reality appears to be that someone outside the Chronicle provided the body cam footage to the Chronicle, and as I've noted, the only public records request I could find that would have that body cam footage was the one from Sean Swope. And so, small town politics. Things are really moving here. It's very odd. All right, so I hope you're all still with me here. I want to move on now to the Criminal Justice Training Commission complaints. And like I said, there are two referenced throughout all of this, both of which are complaints against Deputy, now Detective Aaron Willie. The oldest was submitted in December of 2022, over 2 years ago, by, local activist, political gadfly, and super gay chief shop owner Kyle Wheeler. According to local activist, political gadfly, and super gay chief shop owner Kyle Wheeler, the Chronicle has been aware of this complaint since shortly after it was submitted, as he himself provided it to Emily Fitzgerald, the very same Emily Fitzgerald that wrote the article on February 6, 2025, covering this whole mess. Regarding that complaint, the Chronicle reported, after completing an investigation into the 2022 complaint, the CJTC filed a statement of charges against Willie on November 13th, 2024, which was served to Willie on November 26th. In the statement of charges, the CJTC states that it received a complaint alleging that Willie, quote, engaged in conduct subjecting her peace officer certification to discipline, unquote. Discipline could include remedial training or denial, suspension or revocation of her peace officer certification. Willie has requested a hearing on the charges, which is scheduled for July 15th to July 18th. So that's the first CJTC complaint. We have the second one against Aaron Willie was submitted by Scott Pollock on November 26th, and the Chronicle reported it like so. In his complaint to the CJTC against Willie, Scott Pollock alleged that Willie basically referred me for prosecution, accusing me of malicious prosecution, disorderly conduct, after I reported to her that I had been threatened by a neighbor subject to a protective order. I am the petitioner. The Chronicle article goes on to state that Snaza said January 24th that he believed Scott Pollock's complaint against Willie is, quote, going nowhere because, quote, it's not a valid complaint. The CJTC notified the Sheriff's Office on January 29th that it had finished reviewing Scott Pollock's complaint and determined that the alleged conduct does not invoke the CJTC's jurisdiction. As a result, The CJTC told the sheriff's office in an email, "We are closing the case without further action." All right. So given that I'm interested in the sourcing of some of this information, I was curious how Scott Pollock's Criminal Justice Training Commission complaint ended up in the hands of the Chronicle. Now, it's literally referenced verbatim in the article. And my original assumption was just that Snaza provided it to them after the complaint was closed by the time this was reported. However, in an email sent to Lindsay Pollock dated January 14th, 2025, Chronicle reporter Emily Fitzgerald reached out for comment on the CJTC complaint. Specifically, quote, "The article will also include information on the CJTC complaint filed by your husband, but clarifies that you are not named in the complaint." Okay, so yet, according to the Chronicle's own coverage, the CJTC complaint wasn't closed until January 29th, which is 5 days after Emily's email. I did check and find that Emily Fitzgerald had put in a public records request on January 7th, 2025, for documents associated with the complaint regarding Aaron Willie. However, the complaint she referred to in the request was the one from local activist, political gadfly, and super gay cheese shop owner Kyle Wheeler, and not the one from Scott Pollock. Just in case her public records request did snag the files related to Scott Pollock's request, I reached out to the Criminal Justice Training Commission and was informed that as of February 20th, no files have been provided on her public records request. So I don't think it would be unfair to assume that Snaza likely sourced this complaint to the Chronicle, and under most circumstances, I would assume that this is within his discretion to do so. However, it does open up for some concerns given that at the time, Snaza was a commissioner for the Criminal Justice Training Commission. I don't know the specifics of policy around this type of thing, but it seems to me to be at least fair to question if it's proper for a sitting Criminal Justice Training Commission commissioner to provide details on a complaint against his own employee to a news outlet while it is still apparently an active investigation. Given how close this was, or how close it was to the complaint being closed, perhaps the writing was on the wall in this sort of a gray area. I don't know. I could give the benefit of the doubt here and just assume that it's all above board. However, if we go back just a bit to December, I think there's some information regarding all of this that is useful for this discussion. On December 2nd, the Lewis County Commissioners held the levies and budget meeting, which is, always a good time in local politics. And according to the meeting minutes, Commissioner Pollock had this to say, quote, "Commissioner Pollock said discussions about proposed cuts to the sheriff's office centered on vacant positions. She said the sheriff's office has suffered staffing losses due to its culture. She noted that the sheriff's office has 6 employees who are on the Brady list and therefore cannot testify. Commissioner Pollock said voters could be asked to decide whether they would like to fund public safety through property taxes or to move to a public safety tax instead." So there's a few things to note here. One, this is very much a precursor and related to the concerns that Pollock would express 1 month later in the inciting incident meeting. And 2, exactly 2 weeks after these December 2nd comments, Aaron Willie would receive her assignment to the detective division. And I just want to remind people that the framing of this whole issue from Snaza is that Commissioner Pollock was retaliating against Aaron Willie, specifically in the public voicing of her concerns. So now, returning our attention to the meeting minutes from December 2nd, we can also see that, as usual, Swope responds to Pollock's comments. And I quote, "Commissioner Swope noted that the county loses deputies to surrounding governmental entities that have higher starting pay. He noted that Commissioner Pollock had issued a complaint about one of the county's deputies. Commissioner Pollock responded that she had not issued such a complaint." Commissioner Swope appears to be referring to Scott Pollock's Criminal Justice Training Commissioner complaint against Aaron Willie, and I think that is telling in some sense. As I've already stated, we know that Scott Pollock submitted his complaint to the CJTC on Tuesday, November 26, 2024. Thanksgiving was the 28th and the 29th. The December 2nd meeting, where this is brought up, was the following Monday, less than a week after it had been filed. Furthermore, according to Commissioner Pollock, her husband received acknowledgement of his Criminal Justice Training Commission complaint at 8:55 a.m. on December 2nd. The budget meeting was at 10 a.m. that day, and according to the meeting minutes, Swope already had knowledge of it. The question I have is this: is it appropriate for a Criminal Justice Training Commission commissioner to disseminate information regarding an active complaint against his own office to uninvolved parties? Maybe it is. Perhaps this is all above board and completely normal. Maybe it's up to Snaza's own discretion. I have no idea, but it does raise some questions. So let's return to the claim of retaliation. I'm not convinced that Snaza's claim of retaliation holds here, given the apparent retaliation was simply to highlight his questionable actions. The issue that our Lewis County Sheriff's Office has more than a few officers with Brady letters, and that may impact their ability to execute certain expectations of their job, I think that's a valid critique. The fact that this was a concern before Aaron Willie was ever promoted also seems to undermine Snaza's accusation, at least in regards to Willie's promotion. I would think, should Commissioner Pollock want to engage in retaliation, that she might be like more effective by actually mentioning Aaron Willie by name in her concerns, or even like gendering her. You know, like, as it stands right now, Snaza is the one who publicly named Aaron Willie regarding this situation. And then I think, for my take, isolating one instance, in this case Willie's promotion, as the sole reason for concern regarding public safety and risk, while ignoring other issues like Jeff Humphrey or Aaron Christensen or the Don't Be a Sheep drama or DEA issues or JNED or whatever, I think it's sort of disingenuous of Snaza. Also, and this is kind of a throwaway point, he's a sheriff. Criticism comes with the job. And sometimes that criticism is going to come from other elected officials. It certainly is going to happen when the people who sign off on his budget have to take the heat for justifying it. So I think a more profitable discussion on this whole mess would be to focus on Brady letters and what they mean and what they don't mean. It was nice to see this discussion unfold online where Thurston County Sheriff Derek Sanders weighed in. According to him, Brady letters can be abused or misused, with some prosecutors apparently handing them out like candy. This is the type of nuance and depth that I'd like to see more of. If Jonathan Meyer hands out Brady letters, you know, because it's a Monday and the deputy didn't hold the elevator for him, I think that should inform our view of how serious to take these things. Likewise, if we are being asked what has a greater impact on the safety and performance of our elected officials and their duty, I have far more concern over a detective's potential affiliation and participation in a questionable group than I do with an ongoing harassment dispute with a commissioner's husband and their neighbor. I mean, I don't think these are the same. If I was a victim or the potential subject of an investigation, I would certainly be concerned if the detective working the case had a former affiliation with a group that has been labeled, quote, overtly Islamophobic and, quote, transphobic and anti-immigration. Like, if I found myself in one of those categories, I would certainly be concerned about whether I was going to see justice, either as a victim or as the potential subject of an investigation. So I think the big question now is, like, what do we get from all this? My intention starting out was to try and capture some of the machinations that take place behind our local politics. It's absolutely stunning how crazy small town politics can get. Anger, agitation, and paranoia. It's like truly a wild and easy trap to fall into. And while it can be interesting to watch play out, the truth is there's a lot of drama that goes on that can be a distraction to those tasked with governing, as well as to the community as a whole. Phew, I'm tired. So I've left a bunch of stuff on the cutting room floor. I think this all just paints a picture of the crazy amount of machinations that go on behind the scenes in our little tiny community here, in our county. And if you made it all the way through this episode and you were able to track all these moving pieces, congratulations. You're the real heroes. And I think that's going to do it for this episode. So I will catch you next time.